If your son's new mother-in-law spat in your face in front of 600 people and your son watched it happen, how long would you wait for him to move? I waited 3 seconds. I counted them. I have counted them every day since. I was standing at the edge of a wedding tent on a bluff over Narragansett Bay, in a jacket I bought off a rack for $90, trying to get a clear look at my boy in his tuxedo. And a woman I had met exactly twice crossed the grass and put her face 6 inches from mine and spat on me. The string trio stopped playing. 600 people turned around. You could hear ice moving in the glasses. And she said, loud enough for the last row to hear it, I told Blythe this would happen. You couldn't even rent a decent suit for your own son's wedding. Nobody said anything. Not one person in that tent said anything. And here's the part that nobody in that tent knew. 3 months earlier, I had wired $385,000 to the woman standing 8 feet behind her. Every flower in that tent, every oyster on every tower, every note that trio played, every folding chair on that lawn. I paid for all of it, anonymously, because my son asked me to. He'd said, "Dad, her family's particular about appearances. If they think they're the ones giving us this wedding, everything's easier. You'd rather nobody knew what you had anyway." And I said yes. I have never in my life been able to tell that boy no. So I stood at the edge of a party I'd bought and let 600 people look at me like something the caterers should have removed. And then my son crossed the grass. For 1 second I thought he was coming to stand next to me. He took my arm, and he said, quietly, so only I could hear it, "Dad, please, just go. You're making this worse." I let him walk me out. I want you to understand something. Losing the money never frightened me. I made money for 40 years in water, so dark I couldn't see my own hands. What frightened me was standing in that parking lot in the rain, soaked through, and understanding that my son had watched his father get humiliated in public, and his first instinct wasn't to confront the woman who did it. It was to remove the father, because that was the smaller problem. That night, a man I barely knew told me my hotel reservation had been canceled by mistake. He said it very kindly. He said my bags had already been moved out past the airport. Nobody moves a father's luggage without asking the father, unless they need that father somewhere he can't watch too closely. And when I finally started pulling on that thread, I found something I still can't say out loud without stopping in the middle of it. They weren't just stealing from my son. There was a form, a real one, filled out correctly, filed properly, sitting in a folder with a case number on it. And if that form had been approved, my son would no longer have had the legal right to make a single decision about his own life. Not his money, not his medical care, not where he lived. Somebody had already signed it. And here's the part I'd ask you to stay for. Because at the end of all this, I got everything back, every dollar. The people who did it lost everything they had, and it did not fix the thing I actually needed fixed. Let me back all the way up. My name is Emerson Taveras. Everybody's called me Sonny since I was a kid in Fall River, which was my grandmother's doing and which stopped being funny about 50 years ago, and I'm 69 years old. I was a commercial diver. That's what I did for a living from 1976 until my knees and my ears made the decision for me. Underwater welding and cutting, bridge piers, dam intakes, outfall pipes, pilings, anything structural that lives below the waterline. And I want to tell you what that work is actually like, because everything I understand about the rest of this comes straight out of it. People imagine clear blue water. That's diving on vacation. Working dives in a river or a harbor are done in what we call black water, zero visibility. You go down 30 feet, and the light dies at about 6, and after that you are working entirely by hand. You feel the weld seam, you feel the crack. You run your glove along a pier and you find the void by the way the surface changes under your fingers. You cannot see the thing you're fixing, ever. And so you learn something in that trade that I have never been able to unlearn, which is this: you trust your hands and you distrust your certainty. Because down there, being sure is how men die. Being sure is how a guy comes up with a bad cut and a bridge fails in 11 years. 40 years of that. And then I came up onto dry land, into a life with lights on and everybody's faces visible, and I got sure about my own son, and I never once put my hand out to check. I started with 1 truck and a borrowed compressor in 1984. I got a subcontract on a fender system in Providence, then a state bridge job, then 2. Taveras Subsea Group. By the time I sold my majority stake in 2021, We had 140 divers and tenders, and worked from Portland down to Norfolk, and I was worth a number I have never once said out loud in a room with my son in it. That's the part that matters. Hold on to that. Because I spent 30 years dressing like the man I used to be instead of the man I'd become, and I told myself for 30 years that it was humility. It was not humility. I'll get to what it actually was. Julian was 6 when his mother died. Delia. Aneurysm. At a kitchen table. On a Wednesday. She was 34. After that, it was the two of us in a second-floor apartment over a laundromat, and I was diving 6 days a week and hiring a neighbor named Fatima to sit with him at night for $4 an hour that I did not have. I missed a lot. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. There were 3 weeks in '89 when I was on a job in Delaware, and I saw my son twice. But here is what I did. Every Sunday morning of that boy's childhood, from 6 years old to 17, we went down to the water. Every single Sunday. No exceptions, no matter what shift I'd worked. We'd sit on the rocks at Fort Wetherill, and I'd quiz him on knots and he'd quiz me on dinosaurs. And when he was about 9, he started bringing a notebook and drawing the boats. That's how he ended up in architecture. Those notebooks. He was a good kid. He is a good man. I need that on the record before I tell you the rest of it, because I'm about to describe some things he did, and I don't want anybody watching this to walk away thinking my son is a bad person. He isn't. That's actually the whole problem. He met Blythe Ansell at a non-profit fundraiser in Newport where he donated a rendering. The Ansells are one of those families. 3rd and 4th generation. There's a name on a boathouse. There's a name on a wing of a hospital. Prentice Ansell, her father, developed marinas and waterfront property, and everybody in that part of the state assumed he owned about half of it outright. Corinne Ansell, her mother, ran 2 boards and a garden club and had an opinion about everybody. I met them twice in 2 years. The first time was a lunch where Corinne asked me what I used to do and then, before I answered, asked a waiter about the fish. I did not care. I want to be honest, I genuinely did not care. I have been condescended to by better people than Corinne Ansell, and I have been paid by most of them. What I cared about was that in the 18 months after that lunch, 3 things happened to my son. He left his job at the architecture firm. Blythe told him her father could set him up with something better once the wedding was over, something that matched. He moved out of his apartment and into a guest cottage on the Ansell property, just until they found their own place. And his phone calls to me got shorter, and every opinion in them started to sound like somebody else's. 3 things, all in 18 months, all at the suggestion of the same family. I noticed every single one of them. I noticed them in real time, and I said nothing, because I did not want to be the sour old man who couldn't be happy for his son. Remember that. That comes back. In March, we had coffee at a place on Thames Street, and he asked me for the money. Not directly. He never asked for anything directly in his life. He talked around it for about 10 minutes, and then he said the wedding had gotten out of hand, that Blythe's mother had a vision, and that the number had come in at something the Ansells were being cagey about. And then he said, and I remember this exactly, Dad, if it came from them, it'd just be easier. I said I'd cover it. He said, you can't tell them. I said, all right. And then my son said something that I've turned over about 400 times since. He said, you'd rather nobody knew what you had anyway. That's kind of your whole thing. And he laughed. And I laughed too. I sent $385,000 to an event designer in Bristol 9 days later, through a business account with a name on it that means nothing to anybody. And then I bought a $90 jacket, because that's what I wear, and I flew back for my son's wedding. I want to say one thing about the tent, and then I'll move on. If you have ever been in a room where something was done to you in public and nobody said a word, you already know the specific thing I'm about to describe. It isn't the act. You get over the act. It's the silence afterward. It's the 2 or 3 seconds where a whole room does math about you. And the math is this person worth the social cost of defending? 600 people ran that calculation on me at the same time, and every one of them came back with the same answer. I didn't wipe my face for a while. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strength. It was that I couldn't decide whether wiping it would look like I minded. That's what that kind of humiliation does to a grown man. It gets you negotiating with yourself about how to look while it's happening. Prentice Ansell found me in the valet line about an hour later, in the rain. He put out his hand, and I didn't take it, and he pretended not to notice, and he apologized on his wife's behalf. He said Corinne had been on a new medication. He said it affected her filter. He said she was mortified. It was a smooth story. Very smooth. It handed everybody in that tent a reason to move on. And then he said the second thing, and the second thing is what actually saved my son. He said there'd been a mix-up with my hotel downtown. Double booking on their end. My things had already been moved to a place out by the airport. And then he said, Julian asked me to let you know. Something went cold in my chest that had nothing to do with the rain. Because I have negotiated a great many contracts with a great many people, and I will tell you the single most reliable warning sign there is. It's when somebody hands you an explanation you didn't ask for. I hadn't asked about my hotel. I hadn't mentioned my hotel. That man came out into the rain to explain a problem I did not yet know I had. I drove downtown anyway. The clerk was maybe 23, and she felt terrible. My reservation had been canceled at 6:40 that evening. The request had come from the wedding's designated coordinator, which was an assistant in Prentice Ansell's office, citing a family emergency on my end. My bags had been couriered to a motel 19 miles out. Nobody cancels a man's room at a hotel he paid for himself and moves his luggage 19 miles without asking him, unless they need him out of the way for a night. The motel room smelled like bleach, losing a fight with cigarettes, and there was a sign outside that put red light across the ceiling every 4 seconds. I did not sleep at all. I sat on the edge of that bed and did the thing you do in black water. I stopped trying to see, and I started running my hand along the seam. The job he quit, the house he moved into, the phone calls that got shorter, and then I remembered the folder. 3 weeks before the wedding, I'd been on the porch of that guest cottage having coffee with Julian, and Blythe came out holding a manila envelope, and she had the bright face people put on when they're delivering something they've already decided about. She said her father's attorney needed it before the wedding. She said it was beneficiary paperwork, now that their finances were combining. She said, "Don't worry about the legal part. I already read it." And my son signed every page. He didn't read one line. He signed it the way he has signed everything his entire life, which is trustingly, because I raised him in a house where nobody lied to him. I raised him to be exactly the kind of man those people were looking for. I did that, and I glanced at the letterhead as the pages turned, and it said, Halstead Fiduciary Partners, which is the firm that had administered the trust I set up for my son in 2011. $6,400,000. His outright at 35 or on his marriage, whichever came first. Julian believed that trust was essentially everything I had. He thought it was some lucky commercial real estate from the 80s and a good sale. He had no idea it was a rounding error. But Blythe knew about the trust. And by that night, sitting in a motel out by the airport, I understood that Prentice Ansell knew about it too. At 3 in the morning, I called Imogen Park. Imogen ran legal and finance for me for 12 years, and she does not do small talk at any hour. She picked up on the second ring and said, "Sonny," and I told her everything. The tent, the hotel, the folder, and I said I wanted a complete picture of the Ansell family holdings by sunrise. Quiet, nothing formal, nothing that generates a letter to anybody. She said, "You think this is worse than a rude mother-in-law?" I said, "I think my son signed something 2 weeks ago and nobody let him read it." At 9:05 the next morning, I walked into the lobby of Halstead Fiduciary Partners in Providence. And here's where the version of this story you'd expect goes one way and mine goes another. I didn't put on coveralls and shock anybody with a black card. I've never owned a card like that, and I wouldn't know what to do with one. I walked in wearing the same $90 jacket, and I said one sentence to the woman at the desk. I said, "My name is Emerson Tavares. I'm the grantor of the Julian Tavares Irrevocable Trust, and I need to see whoever administers it, right now." Grantor. That's not a flex. That's not money talking. That is a legal word that means I am the person who created this instrument, and every single person in that building knew what it meant. I was in an office in 6 minutes. The man's name was Doug, and he had a good handshake, and about 4 seconds later, he had no color in his face at all. I asked him to pull whatever my son had executed on the 11th. It was not a beneficiary update. It was a durable power of attorney, granting management authority over the entire trust corpus to a family office controlled by Prentice Ansell. For the purpose, and this is the actual phrase in the document of coordinated household estate planning, which means nothing. which is exactly why it's in there. I asked him whether anything had moved. He turned his monitor, and there was a scheduled outbound transfer. The full corpus, 6.4 million, routing through a correspondent bank and then out to an account I had never heard of. Scheduled to release at 10 a.m. It was 9:31. I said, "Stop it." He started talking about authorization and liability, and how the instructing parties counsel would escalate. And I leaned on that desk, and I said the only hard thing I said that entire week. I said, "Doug, I funded this trust. I'm telling you, on the record, that its instructing authority was obtained by fraud. If that wire clears this building, I will personally make sure that every regulator with jurisdiction over your firm learns your name before lunch. Now put a hold on it." He put a hold on it. The transfer failed at 9:56. 4 minutes. I sat in my truck in a parking garage in Providence, and my hands were shaking so hard I couldn't get the key in. And I want to tell you what I was actually feeling, because it was not triumph. It was that I had come within 4 minutes. 4 minutes. If Corinne Ansell had kept her composure in that tent, if she had simply been polite to me for one more evening, I'd have flown home Sunday, feeling small and saying nothing, and my son would have lost every dollar and never known why. The woman who tried to humiliate me is the only reason I looked. I've never known what to do with that. Imogen called at 11 with the audit. Ansell Development had been technically insolvent for the better part of 4 years. The waterfront parcels everybody assumed Prentice owned free and clear were leveraged to the roofline, cross-collateralized, and refinanced twice. He owed a little over $14 million, and about 5 of that was to a private lending outfit in Florida that does not send polite reminder letters. 14 million. And my son had just married into the middle of it with 6.4 in his name. That wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a performance for creditors. 600 people, oyster towers, a string trio, every bit of it staged to look like a family that was doing fine, in front of exactly the people who needed to keep believing that. And I paid for it. I funded the theater that was staged to steal from my son. If you have ever been used as the proof of something you were actually the victim of, if you've ever found out you were the receipt, somebody waved around, you know that particular flavor of sick. My phone rang at 11:40. It was Julian, and for about half a second I thought he knows. He found out. He's calling me. He said, "Dad, what did you do?" His voice was shaking, not with fear, with fury. He said the Ansells had called Blythe in tears. He said I had frozen their accounts during their honeymoon week. He asked me if I had lost my mind. Prentice had gotten to him first. Of course he had. Prentice Ansell had been getting to him first for 18 months. I said, "Julian, that folder Blythe had you sign." And he cut me off. He said, Don't you dare turn this into her family being predators. Prentice has done nothing but help us. He's setting up a joint account so we can buy a house. And you come in like some paranoid old man and freeze it because you can't stand that I have a family that isn't just you." I want to sit in that sentence for a second, because I've had a lot of time with it. A family that isn't just you. There's a version of me that hears that and gets angry. That's not the version that answered. Because the man on that phone was 33 years old and had spent 18 months inside a house where one family controlled his job, his address, his money, and his information, and the only thing left to arrange was his opinion of me. That's not betrayal. That's what harvesting looks like from the inside. I said, "Son, I need you to trust me for 48 hours. And he said, "Trust you? You've kept things from me my entire life, Dad. God knows what else there is." And there it was. He wasn't wrong. That's the thing. He was not wrong. I had kept something from him his entire life. I'd kept the single largest fact about our family from him for 30 years and called it modesty. And the exact hole that left in him, the not knowing what he was actually standing on, the not knowing who his father actually was, is the hole those people walked into. He said, "Release the account. If you don't, I don't know what that means for us." And he hung up. I sat in that garage for about 10 minutes. Then I called Imogen back and I said, "Get everything. Not just the money, everything they filed." 2 days later, she sent me a scanned PDF and a message that said only, "Call me before you open this." I opened it first. Of course I did. It was a request for a capacity evaluation, submitted by the family office holding the power of attorney my son had signed without reading, filed with a psychiatric practice in East Greenwich. requesting a formal assessment of Julian Tavares's competency to manage his own financial affairs. Attached to it was a 2-page summary of observed concerns: anxiety, difficulty with decisions, reliance on family members for major choices, episodes of agitation reported by household members. It was signed by his wife, and there was a note in the margin, handwritten in a different pen, that read, "After honeymoon, don't rush it." Here's what that form is. If a court accepts a capacity finding, it can appoint somebody to manage a person's affairs, their money, their medical decisions, where they live, who visits. They weren't going to steal $6.4 million from my son. They were going to steal my son, take the money, and if he ever noticed, or complained, or hired a lawyer, they'd have 18 months of documented concern from his own household saying the poor man wasn't well. I have been in some bad places. I've been in a flooded caisson in Newark with a hose kink and 40 seconds of decision-making left. I have never in my life felt what I felt reading a form. Because a form is patient. A form doesn't lose its temper. Somebody sat at a desk with good light and filled that out carefully, and checked it, and wrote "Don't rush it" in the margin. Now I promised I'd be fair to these people, and I'm going to be. Because a story where the villains are just greedy is a story you forget by Thursday. Imogen's file told me 2 more things. The first is that Prentice Ansell never built anything. Not one thing. He inherited a name, a set of expectations, and a portfolio that had already started dying before he touched it. Every deal of his I could find from the last 20 years was a refinance of an older deal. That man spent 40 years maintaining an appearance of a fortune that stopped existing around 2009, and everybody he knew, his wife, his daughter, his club, his church, required him to keep maintaining it. He was not a rich man doing a crime. He was a broke man doing a full-time job called being an Ansell, and he had been doing it since he was 24 years old, and I don't think anybody ever asked him if he wanted to. And the second thing was an apartment lease in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in his name, and 11 months of tuition payments to a preschool up there. Her name is Marisa. The child's name is Wren. She's 4, and I'll tell you the truth. When I found that, I didn't feel disgust. I felt something closer to recognition. Because that's the one place in that man's entire life where nobody expected him to be an Ansell. That is not an excuse. He filed a form to take my son's mind away from him. There is no excuse, and I'm not offering one. But if you want to know how a person gets there, that's how. Not evil. 40 years of maintaining something that isn't real, and one small room somewhere where he got to put it down. And Corinne knew. Not the details, but she knew the shape of it. She'd known for 2 years that the money was gone, and that is why she did what she did in that tent. She didn't spit on me because she thought I was poor. She spat on me because a shabby old man in a cheap jacket walked up to the edge of her daughter's $500,000 wedding, and for 1 second she looked at me and saw the truth walking into the party. She wasn't attacking me. She was attacking a mirror. The invitation came Saturday. Heavy cream card, gold lettering, a post-wedding reception at the Ansell house that evening, sent by an assistant working off a guest list nobody had bothered to correct after they threw me out. I put it in my jacket pocket, and I want to tell you exactly what I decided in my kitchen that afternoon, because everybody assumes I went there to destroy Prentice Ansell. I didn't. Imogen already had it handled. That's the boring truth. The federal side was already moving, because a capacity request filed under a power of attorney obtained through misrepresentation, combined with an attempted wire of $6.4 million, is not a thing that requires a dramatic old man to make it happen. It requires a competent lawyer in about 96 hours. I went to that house for one reason. I went to get my son out of it. I got there at 8:40. There were maybe 90 people. Caterers. A quartet in the corner of a room with a ceiling 20 feet high and a view straight down the bay. I did not put my shoulder into the door. I'm 69 and I have a rebuilt knee. I walked up the steps and a man in a headset asked for my name, and I gave it, and it was on the list, because nobody had corrected the list. And I walked in. I want to slow this all the way down now, because this is the part I actually think about. The first person who saw me was a caterer. Young guy, tray of glasses, and he saw my face, and he stopped, and he looked around for somebody to tell, and there wasn't anybody, so he just stood there holding a tray. The second was Corinne. She was near the fireplace with 2 women, and she turned, and her hand went up to the base of her throat, and she did not say one word. Not one. The woman who'd found her voice in front of 600 people had nothing at all in a room of 90. The third was Blythe. She was near the windows, and she saw me, and she immediately looked for her father. And then Prentice came across that floor at me fast, and he had his hand out and a smile on, and he said, loud, for the room, Sonny. Now, come on. I think we all need to let this settle. Let this settle. I looked at that man's face, and I have to tell you what I noticed, because it's not what I expected. He was exhausted. Up close, in that light, Prentice Ansell looked like a man who had not slept properly in about 4 years. Gray under the eyes, a tremor in the hand he was holding out to me. And for 1 second, I'm not proud of this. And I'm not ashamed of it either. For 1 second, I felt sorry for him. Then I remembered a handwritten note in a margin. I said, I'm not here for you. And I walked past him. The room went quiet in that way. Rooms do. From the middle outward. The quartet kept playing for another 8 or 9 seconds, and then the cellist noticed, and they stopped one instrument at a time, which is somehow so much worse than all at once. And I crossed that floor to my son. Julian was standing by the windows with a drink he wasn't drinking, and I looked at him properly for the first time in 3 weeks. He'd lost weight, not a little. His jacket was hanging off his shoulders, and there was a gray cast to his face, and his eyes had that slow, swimming quality I have seen exactly twice in my life, and both times the man had been prescribed something by somebody. That's my kid, 33 years old. I said, Julian. He said, Dad, you can't be here. I took the folder out of my jacket. I didn't open it dramatically. I just held it. And I said, 3 weeks ago, Blythe brought you an envelope on the porch and told you it was beneficiary paperwork. Do you remember? He said, Dad. I said, it was a power of attorney. It moved control of your entire trust to Prentice's office. On Thursday morning at 10 o'clock, $6.4 million was scheduled to leave the country. I stopped it at 9:56. He didn't move. And I said, and on the 29th, that same office filed a request with a psychiatric practice in East Greenwich for a formal evaluation of your capacity to manage your own affairs. I held out the page. I said, your wife signed it. There's a note on it in somebody's handwriting that says, after honeymoon, don't rush it. Now, here is the 3 seconds. There are always 3 seconds. I've come to believe that. Blythe said, Julian, just his name, from about 12 feet away. And Prentice said, from behind me, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound calm, son, that's a document taken out of context, and I'd be careful about. And my son stood there with the page in his hand, and he looked at it. And then he looked up, and he did not look at me. He looked at his wife. 1, 2, 3. I want to describe what that's like, because I don't think anybody ever does. You are not angry in those 3 seconds. That comes later. In the moment itself, there is no feeling at all. There's just an enormous amount of information arriving very quickly about where you actually stand with somebody. I watched my son's eyes go to that woman's face for instruction. 33 years. Every Sunday morning of his childhood on the rocks at Fort Wetherill, and in the most important 3 seconds of his life, the person he checked with was somebody he'd known for 2 years. And I understood something in that room that I could not have understood anywhere else. He wasn't choosing her over me. He genuinely did not know what was true anymore, and he had been trained, carefully, over 18 months, that she was where truth came from. That's what they took. Not the money. They took his ability to know a thing on his own. Then Blythe made her only real mistake of the entire 18 months. She said, Jules, put it down. Put it down. Not, that's not what it looks like. Not, let me explain. Not, I would never. Put it down. She gave him an instruction, and I watched something come back into my son's face that I had not seen since he was about 19 years old. He read the page again. All of it. It takes about 40 seconds, and nobody in that room said a word for all 40 of them. And then he said, without looking up, this is your signature. She said, Julian. He said, Blythe, this is your signature. And she didn't answer. That was the whole thing. That was the entire climax of 18 months and $6.4 million, a woman not answering a question in a room with a view of the water. Prentice tried one more time. He came around into my son's eyeline, and started talking about how this was an administrative precaution that any family office would take, that estate coordination sometimes required standing documentation, and he was still talking when Julian handed him back the page. And my son said, "There's a note on it. In your handwriting. Nobody was arrested that night. I know that's the ending people want, and I'm not going to invent one. What actually happened is that 90 people in evening clothes began finding their coats, and they did it fast, and they did it without saying goodbye to anybody, and within about 12 minutes that enormous room had maybe 15 people in it, and every surface had a half-finished drink on it. That's how it really goes. There's no gasp. There's just a room emptying. Corinne Ansell stood by that fireplace the entire time, and never moved, and never said one word to me. Not that night. Not ever. And Julian walked out of his in-laws' house with nothing but his jacket, and got into a 19-year-old truck with his father, and we drove. He didn't talk for about 11 miles. Then somewhere near Wickford he said, "I need you to pull over." And he got out, and he was sick in the grass on the side of Route 1A, and I stood there and put my hand between his shoulder blades the way you do. Then he sat down on the guardrail and said, "How long did you know?" And I said, "Since Wednesday." And he said, "No. About them. How long?" That was the real question. That's the one that mattered. And I had to tell my son the truth, which was, I noticed 18 months ago. I noticed when he quit his job. I noticed when he moved onto their property. I noticed when his phone calls got short. And I said nothing, every single time, because I did not want to be the difficult old man who couldn't be happy for him. I sat on a guardrail on Route 1A and told my son that I had watched it happen in slow motion and kept my mouth shut to protect my own image as an easy father. He said, "Why didn't you say something?" And I said, "Because I wanted you to like me." That's the truest sentence in this entire story, and it cost me more to say than anything else in it. Here's where things landed. Prentice Ansell is awaiting trial, wire fraud, and a second set of charges relating to the capacity filing that I'm told is fairly novel, and I'm not going to pretend I understand all of it. The properties went. The house went. The lending outfit in Florida got in line behind the government and did not enjoy it. I want to be clear about one thing, because the version of this story where I bought his debt and owned him would be a better story, and it isn't the true one. I did not do anything clever. I made one phone call to a lawyer at 3 a.m, and then I got out of the way of people whose job it is. That's what I'd tell anybody. You don't need to be rich to survive something like this. You need to be quick, and you need to call somebody by sunrise instead of sitting on it for a week hoping it's nothing. Blythe and Julian's marriage was annulled. It took 9 months, which surprised me. Corinne moved to her sister's in Vermont. And Marisa, the woman in Portsmouth, Imogen, found out later that she had no idea. None. She thought Prentice was a divorced consultant who traveled. She found out what her daughter's father actually was, from a reporter's voicemail. That's a 4-year-old girl who's going to grow up with a version of this too, and nobody's making a video about her. Julian moved back into a place near the water in Wickford. Small, 1 bedroom. He went back to work in January, at a smaller firm, doing marine and waterfront design, and he's good at it. He comes down most Sundays. And here's the last thing, and it's the whole reason I've told you any of this. We're all right, but we are not the same. Everybody wants the ending where the son collapses into his father's arms, and it's fixed. And he did, and it wasn't. Because I still saw the 3 seconds. I love that boy more than I have ever loved anything, and I would go into black water for him tomorrow, and I will also never again be 100% certain what he'd do if a room went quiet. That's the truth. That's just the truth. And what I've learned in the 18 months since is that forgiveness is not the same as deciding it never happened. I forgave him. Completely. And I meant it. And I'd do it again. But for about a year I did the thing most families do, which is I forgave him by agreeing never to mention it. We just didn't bring it up. We talked about the boat and his job and the socks, and we were extremely careful with each other, and it was pleasant and it was thin as paper. And one Sunday in October, I finally said it out loud. On the rocks at Fort Wetherill, where I used to quiz him on knots, I said, "You didn't move. In that room, for 3 seconds you looked at her instead of me, and I've never stopped seeing it, and I'm not angry, but I'm not going to pretend anymore that I don't see it." And he cried. And he said he'd been waiting a year for me to say it, and that the not saying it was worse. And then we never talked about it again. but differently. Not because it was forbidden, because it was finished. That's the whole lesson, and I'll say it as plainly as I can. A thing you've agreed never to mention has not been forgiven. It's been buried alive, and it will move around under the floor for the rest of your life. You get to say it once, out loud, plainly, without a speech, without making the person grovel, and then you actually stop. That's the difference between a family that heals and a family that just gets very good manners. So here's what I'd ask you to do this week, and it's the practical one. Think about somebody you love, and look at the last 18 months of their life, and check for 3 things at once. Did they change where they work? Did they change where they live? And did the people they talk to change? One of those on its own is a normal year. Everybody has a normal year. But if all 3 moved, and if all 3 moved at the suggestion of the same person, that isn't a new chapter in somebody's life. That is a pattern, and it has a name, and it is worth 1 uncomfortable phone call. I saw all 3 of them happen to my son in real time, and I said nothing for 18 months because I was worried about how I'd come across. Make the call. Be the difficult old man. I'd give a great deal to have been the difficult old man. And the question I'd leave you with, which I still don't have a clean answer to, is there something you have forgiven that you've actually just agreed never to mention? Sit with that one. Mine took me a year. All right. 3 things, and then I'll get out of your evening. First, tell me straight in the comments what you make of the 3 seconds. Comment 1 if you think Julian did nothing wrong at all, that he was isolated and worked on for 18 months, and holding those 3 seconds against him is unfair. Comment 2 if you think a grown man looks at his father in that room no matter what's been done to him, and something real broke there that shouldn't be smoothed over. Or comment 3 if you think the person who actually failed in this story is me, that I watched the whole thing happen for a year and a half, and stayed quiet to protect my own comfort, and my son's 3 seconds were bought and paid for by my 18 months. I know which one I'd pick. I've had a while. Second, tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. There's always somebody out there sitting in a parked car at 1 in the morning, and honestly, that's usually who these are for. And third, only if you want to. If you have ever been in a room where something was done to you and the one person who should have spoken didn't say so, you don't owe anybody the details. 2 words is plenty. Me too. Somebody's going to scroll past your comment tonight and feel a lot less alone because you took 10 seconds. If this one landed somewhere, hit subscribe before you go. I'm one retired diver telling stories about people who got looked past and what it costs on every side. Every subscriber genuinely keeps this going, and I don't take it for granted. Take care of yourselves out there. Trust your hands, distrust your certainty, and go make the uncomfortable phone call. This is a fictional story, inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Newport, Rhode Island, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.